The women stitched in silence, but when one spool of thread unrolled across the floor, it led straight to a bloodstain no one could explain. The discovery came at 17 minutes past 3 on a Tuesday afternoon in the village hall of St. Mary, Mead, when Mrs. Dolly Bantry's navy thread escaped her trembling fingers and rolled beneath the mahogany table where the ladies' sewing circle had gathered for their weekly meeting. The spool bounced once against the worn Persian rug, twice against the oak floorboards, and came to rest against what appeared to be a dark stain that had seeped through the ancient wood planks like spilled tea. Except tea, as Mrs. Bantry would later tell the constable, had never possessed such a deep, rust-coloured hue, nor left such an unmistakable metallic scent hanging in the musty air of the village hall. The 6 women present that afternoon would each remember the moment differently, when questioned later. Mrs. Bantry herself claimed the thread had simply slipped from her arthritic fingers as she attempted to repair a torn seam in her late husband's favourite waistcoat, a sentimental project she'd been avoiding for months since his passing. Mrs. Celia Fortescue, the group's self-appointed leader and wife of the village's most prosperous grocer, insisted she'd noticed nothing unusual until Mrs. Bantry's sharp intake of breath drew everyone's attention to the floor. Miss Lavinia Fullerton, the retired schoolmistress with steel-rimmed spectacles and a mind like a steel trap for village gossip, would later swear she'd detected an odd smell upon entering the hall that afternoon, though she'd attributed it to the damp autumn weather that had plagued the village for weeks. The other 3 members, young Mrs. Sarah Kimball, barely 22, and newly married to the village doctor, Mrs. Edith Swettenham, a war widow with nervous hands who rarely spoke, above a whisper, and Mrs. Gladys Dixon, the vicar's wife with her perpetually anxious demeanour, would each claim different versions of the same unsettling truth, that the stain beneath the table seemed to have appeared from nowhere, and that none of them recalled seeing it during their previous week's gathering in this very same spot. But perhaps most disturbing of all was the realization that dawned simultaneously on each woman as they stared at the dark mark on the floor. Their circle was incomplete. Mrs. Constance Hargreaves, the sharp-tongued widow who lived in the cottage behind the church and never missed a Tuesday meeting, was conspicuously absent for the first time in 3 years. The village hall stood on the edge of St. Mary Mead's modest high street, a sturdy, Victorian building of red brick and tall windows that had served the community for nearly a century. Its main room, where the sewing circle met each week, possessed the particular atmosphere of a space that had witnessed countless gatherings, from wartime meetings during the Blitz to wedding receptions and funeral teas, baby christenings and harvest festivals. The walls bore the accumulated scents and sounds of village life: beeswax polish, old roses, the faint smokiness of winter fires, and the indefinable mustiness that clings to places where people have shared their joys and sorrows for generations. Entrée. This particular Tuesday, however, the familiar comfort of the hall felt somehow violated. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across the room where the women sat in their customary circle of chairs around the mahogany table. Their sewing baskets, usually a cheerful collection of bright fabrics and colourful threads, appeared somehow subdued, as if the discovery of the bloodstain had drained the very life from their innocent domestic pursuits. Mrs. Bantry, her silver hair pinned in its usual neat chignon and her capable hands still trembling slightly, was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "We should call Constable Polk," she said quietly, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had been the doctor's wife for 40 years before her husband's recent death. "This isn't something we can simply ignore." Mrs. Fortescue, adjusting, her wire-rimmed spectacles with the brisk efficiency that characterized all her movements, nodded gravely. "Indeed, though I do hope we're not making much ado about nothing. Perhaps someone simply spilled something last week after our meeting." but even as she spoke, her voice lacked conviction. The stain was too dark, too irregular, and positioned too precisely beneath their usual meeting spot to be dismissed as an innocent accident. Moreover, the cleaning ladies from the church, Mrs. Price and her daughter Margaret, were meticulous in their weekly maintenance of the village hall, and such an obvious mark would never have escaped their notice. Miss Fullerton, who prided herself on her practical nature and attention to detail, rose from her chair and approached the stain more closely, careful not to disturb what might prove to be evidence. Through her steel-rimmed spectacles, she studied the mark with the same methodical observation she had once applied to her pupils' copybooks. "The wood here is quite saturated," she announced to the group. "Whatever this substance is, it's soaked deeply into the grain. This didn't happen recently. I would estimate several days at least, possibly longer." The implications of this observation settled over the group like a cold fog rolling in from the moor. If the stain was indeed several days old, it meant the substance had been present during their previous meetings, hidden beneath the table where they sat in their circle each week, unknowingly sowing above what might very well be evidence of violence. Young Mrs. Kimball, who had been silent since the discovery, suddenly pressed her hand to her mouth. "Mrs. Hargreaves," she whispered, "has anyone seen her since last Tuesday's meeting? I mean, afterward, in the village?" The question hung in the air like incense in a chapel, heavy with unspoken implications. Each woman searched her memory of the past week: trips to the post office, encounters at the grocer's, glimpses across the churchyard during Sunday service. Mrs. Hargreaves, despite her reputation for sharp opinions and occasionally cutting remarks, was a fixture in village life, as predictable as the church bells and as constant as the seasons. Her absence from any gathering was unusual. Her absence from the sewing circle was unprecedented. Mrs. Swettenham, her nervous fingers still clutching an unfinished pillowcase, spoke in her characteristic whisper. "I haven't seen her at all this week, but then she keeps rather to herself between our meetings, lives quite quietly in that cottage of hers." Too quietly, perhaps, Miss Fullerton observed, her teacher's instincts alert to patterns and anomalies. For a woman who usually has quite definite opinions about village affairs, she's been remarkably silent lately. Even last Tuesday she seemed different. Distracted, I thought. Mrs. Fortescue, who prided herself on maintaining social connections throughout the village, frowned as she considered this assessment. "Now that you mention it, she did seem rather preoccupied during our last meeting, kept glancing toward the door, as if she were expecting someone, or perhaps worried about being interrupted." Most unlike her usual manner, the women fell silent again, each lost in her own recollections of their previous gathering. The sewing circle had been meeting in its current form for 3 years, ever since Mrs. Hargreaves had suggested they formalize their occasional gatherings into a regular weekly event. She had proposed the idea with her characteristic directness, arguing that the war had taught them all the value of female companionship and mutual support, and that their peaceful village life should not diminish the bonds they had forged during those difficult years. In the months since, their Tuesday afternoons had become a cherished ritual. They would gather at 3 o'clock precisely, each bringing whatever sewing project currently occupied her attention: mending, embroidery, knitting, or the occasional more ambitious undertaking like a new dress or a baby's layette for one of the village's expanding families. The conversation would flow as smoothly as their needles through fabric, covering everything from village gossip to gardening tips, from family news to book recommendations from the traveling library that visited monthly. Mrs. Hargreaves had established herself as the unofficial chronicler of village history and the keeper of its secrets. Her cottage behind the church had been her home since her husband's death 15 years earlier, and her position as the widow of the former village solicitor gave her a unique perspective on the interconnected relationships and long-held grudges That shaped daily life in St. Mary Mead. She possessed the peculiar gift of remembering not just who had married whom and when, but also who had quarreled with whom and why, who owed money to whom, and which families harbored secrets they preferred to keep buried. This encyclopedic knowledge of village affairs had made her both valuable and occasionally dangerous as a companion. Her observations could illuminate mysteries and resolve disputes, but they could also expose uncomfortable truths and resurrect old grievances that others preferred to leave undisturbed. More than once, her candid commentary had left one of the sewing circle members shifting uncomfortably in her chair, worried about what other observations Mrs. Hargreaves might be storing in her formidable memory. But now, as the 6 remaining women stared at the bloodstain that had been revealed by a runaway spool of thread, Mrs. Hargreaves's absence took on a sinister significance. Had her knowledge of village secrets finally led her into danger? Had someone decided that her observations had become too threatening to ignore? Mrs. Bantry, who had maintained her composure throughout the initial shock of discovery, now took charge of the situation with the decisive manner that had made her an effective doctor's wife for 4 decades. "Miss Fullerton, would you be so kind as to walk to the telephone box and ring Constable Polk? Tell him we need him here immediately. A matter of some urgency in the village hall. The rest of us will remain here to ensure nothing is disturbed." Miss Fullerton nodded and gathered her coat, but paused at the door to look back at her companions. "Should I mention Mrs. Hargreaves's absence specifically?" "Not over the telephone," Mrs. Bantry replied firmly. "Village telephone lines have too many curious ears. Simply tell him he's needed here urgently." As the schoolmistress's footsteps echoed down the front steps of the hall, the remaining 5 women settled into an uncomfortable vigil around the blood-stained floor. None of them attempted to resume their sewing. Instead, they sat in uncharacteristic silence, each lost in her own troubled thoughts about their missing member and the implications of the evidence beneath their feet. The autumn afternoon light continued to fade outside the tall windows, and the familiar sounds of village life, children walking home from school, Mrs. Price's dog barking at the postman, the distant whistle of the evening train, seemed suddenly foreign and distant, as if they belonged to a different world than the one that now contained bloodstains and disappearances. Young Mrs. Kimball broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think someone might have hurt Mrs. Hargreaves, actually hurt her?" The question none of them had dared to speak aloud hung in the gathering dusk, like smoke from a snuffed candle. In their safe, predictable village where the most serious crime in recent memory had been the theft of Mrs. Clement's prize roses, the possibility of actual violence seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Yet the evidence beneath their table suggested that their peaceful world might not be as secure as they had believed. Mrs. Fortescue, ever practical despite her growing unease, addressed the question with characteristic directness. "We must not jump to conclusions. There could be any number of explanations for both the stain and Mrs. Hargreaves's absence. Perhaps she's fallen ill, or had to travel suddenly to attend to family business. The stain might be entirely unrelated, an old accident that was simply overlooked during cleaning." But even as she spoke these reassuring words, Mrs. Fortescue's own expression betrayed her growing concern. She had known Constance Hargreaves for nearly 20 years, ever since the widow had moved to St. Mary Mead, following her husband's death. In all that time, Mrs. Hargreaves had never missed a social obligation without providing advance notice and a detailed explanation. Her reliability was as much a part of her character as her sharp tongue and penetrating observations. Mrs. Swettenham, who rarely contributed to group discussions but observed everything with the quiet intensity of someone who preferred listening to speaking, suddenly looked up from the pillowcase she had been clutching. "She was frightened," she said quietly, surprising the others with her certainty. Last Tuesday during our meeting, I noticed because it was so unlike her usual confidence. She kept looking at her hands while she sewed, as if she were trying to avoid meeting our eyes, and when Mrs. Dixon mentioned the new family moving into Rose Cottage, Mrs. Hargreaves went quite pale. This observation sent a ripple of unease through the group. Mrs. Dixon, the vicar's wife, possessed the nervous temperament of someone who worried constantly about saying the wrong thing or causing offence, and her mention of the new residents had seemed innocent enough at the time. The Ashfords, a young couple with a small child, had recently purchased Rose Cottage from the estate of old Mr. Weatherby, who had died childless the previous spring. Their arrival had been the source of considerable speculation and some excitement in the village, as new families were always a cause for both curiosity and hope. "Did she say anything specific about the new family?" Mrs. Bantry asked, her medical training making her alert to the significance of such reactions. Any particular reason why their arrival might have distressed her? Mrs. Dixon, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the afternoon's revelations, now twisted her wedding ring anxiously. "Nothing specific, no, but I did notice that she seemed to know more about them than the rest of us. When I mentioned that Mr. Ashford worked in the city, something I'd heard from the estate agent, she said something about hoping they would be more suitable neighbours than some we've had. It struck me as an odd comment, since old Mr. Weatherby had been perfectly pleasant. More suitable than some we've had, Miss Fullerton repeated thoughtfully. That suggests she was thinking of other newcomers who had proved problematic in some way, but I can't recall any recent arrivals who caused difficulties." The women fell silent again, each searching her memory for incidents involving previous newcomers to the village. St. Mary Mead was the sort of community where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did, and the arrival of strangers was always noted, discussed, and eventually either accepted or subtly discouraged, depending on how well they integrated into existing social patterns. Mrs. Hargreaves, with her position as the keeper of village history and secrets, would certainly have been aware of any previous problems with newcomers. Her comment suggested she possessed specific knowledge about past incidents that had made her wary of new arrivals, knowledge that apparently the other members of the sewing circle did not share. The sound of approaching footsteps on the front steps interrupted their speculation. Miss Fullerton's voice could be heard in conversation, with a deeper, masculine tone that belonged unmistakably to Constable Polk. The village policeman was a steady, methodical man in his 50s who had served the community faithfully for nearly 2 decades without encountering anything more serious than occasional petty theft and the sorts of domestic disputes that arose in any close-knit community. The door opened to admit Miss Fullerton, followed by Constable Polk's solid figure. The policeman removed his helmet as he entered, revealing thinning grey hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent walking country lanes in all seasons. His presence immediately transformed the atmosphere of the room, lending an official gravity to what had begun as a domestic mystery. "Ladies," he said with a respectful nod to the group, "Miss Fullerton tells me you've discovered something that requires my attention." Mrs. Bantry rose to greet him, her natural authority, making her the obvious spokesperson for the group. "Indeed, Constable, we found what appears to be a bloodstain beneath our usual meeting table, and we're concerned about the absence of one of our regular members, Mrs. Hargreaves." Constable Polk approached the table with the careful deliberation that characterized all his professional actions. He knelt beside the stain, examining it closely without disturbing the surrounding area. His expression grew increasingly serious as he studied the mark, noting its size, position, and the degree to which it had penetrated the wooden floor. "This is certainly blood," he confirmed, after several minutes of examination. "Quite a substantial amount, I'm afraid, and it's been here for several days at minimum, possibly as long as a week." He looked up at the assembled women. "When did you last see Mrs. Hargreaves?" "At our meeting last Tuesday," Mrs. Fortescue replied promptly. "We gather here every week at the same time. She was present then, but seemed somewhat distracted, unlike her usual self. And none of you have seen her since then?" The women exchanged glances, each confirming with subtle nods that Mrs. Hargreaves had indeed vanished from their daily routines without explanation. In a village the size of St. Mary Mead, such an absence was remarkable. Residents typically encountered one another multiple times throughout any given week, whether at the post office, the grocer's, church services, or simply during walks around the village. Constable Palk made careful notes in his official notebook, recording not just the facts but also his observations about the women's demeanor and the obvious concern they felt for their missing friend. His experience in village policing had taught him that local residents often possessed crucial information without realizing its significance, and that careful questioning could reveal important patterns and connections. "Tell me about Mrs. Hargreaves," he requested. "Her routine, her habits, her recent state of mind. Any detail might be important." Mrs. Bantry, as the group's unofficial leader, provided the basic information. Constance Hargreaves, age 63, widow of the former village solicitor, resident of Ivy Cottage behind the church for 15 years. No known family in the immediate area, though she occasionally mentioned a niece in London. Independent means, though not wealthy. Regular attendant at church services and various village activities. But it was Miss Fullerton who provided the more telling details. "She's been different lately, more withdrawn, more watchful. For someone who usually enjoyed sharing village news and observations, she's been remarkably quiet in recent weeks, almost as if she were keeping secrets rather than revealing them." "Keeping secrets," Constable Palk repeated, making another note. "What sort of secrets might she have been keeping?" The question prompted an uncomfortable silence. Each woman knew that Mrs. Hargreaves possessed extensive knowledge of village affairs, both current and historical, but discussing such matters with the police felt like a betrayal of the unspoken confidences that bound their small community together. Finally, Mrs. Swettenham spoke in her quiet voice. She knew things about people, family histories, old disputes, financial difficulties. She didn't gossip maliciously, but she remembered everything, and sometimes her comments revealed more than people were comfortable having revealed. "I see." And had she made any such revealing comments recently? Anything that might have caused someone distress or anger? Again, the women hesitated. Village life depended on a delicate balance of knowing and not knowing, of seeing and not seeing, of speaking and remaining diplomatically silent. Mrs. Hargreaves had occasionally disturbed this balance with her candid observations, but discussing such incidents with the authorities felt like crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. Mrs. Fortescue, ever practical, finally addressed the constable's question directly. There have been occasions when her knowledge of village history proved uncomfortable for certain residents, but I can't believe any of our neighbors would resort to violence over old gossip. "Perhaps not," Constable Polk agreed. "But I'll need to speak with Mrs. Hargreaves to be certain she's safe. Can you direct me to her cottage?" Mrs. Dixon provided detailed directions to Ivy Cottage, though she noted that Mrs. Hargreaves rarely answered her door unless she was expecting visitors. The cottage was situated behind the church, accessible by a narrow lane that branched off from the main churchyard path. It was a small but well-maintained property, with a neat garden that Mrs. Hargreaves tended with the same methodical care she applied to her knowledge of village affairs. As Constable Polk prepared to leave for his investigation, he turned back to the women with a serious expression. "I'll need you ladies to avoid discussing this matter with other residents until I've had a chance to examine the cottage, and determine Mrs. Hargreaves's whereabouts. If she's simply ill or away on business, we don't want to cause unnecessary alarm. But if something more serious has occurred, he left the implication hanging in the air, but his meaning was clear. The discovery of the bloodstain, combined with Mrs. Hargreaves's unexplained absence, suggested the possibility of violence in their peaceful village, a possibility that would shatter the sense of security that residents had taken for granted for generations. After the constable's departure, the women gathered their sewing supplies in subdued silence. The familiar routine of packing needles, threads, and unfinished projects into their respective baskets seemed strangely meaningless after the afternoon's discoveries. How could they return to their domestic concerns when one of their circle might be in danger, when their safe meeting place had been revealed as the scene of possible violence? As they prepared to leave the village hall, Mrs. Bantry voiced what they were all thinking. "We can't simply go home and pretend this hasn't happened. Constance might need our help." "But what can we do?" young Mrs. Kimball asked. Constable Polk asked us not to discuss the matter, and he's perfectly capable of investigating Mrs. Hargreaves's cottage. Miss Fullerton, adjusting her steel-rimmed spectacles with the gesture that always preceded her most considered observations, looked around at her companions. "We can do what we do best: observe, remember, and piece together information. We knew Constance better than anyone else in the village. If something has happened to her, the answer may lie in our understanding of her recent behavior and concerns." The Poe's suggestion appealed to the group's desire to take constructive action. They were, after all, women who had lived through a war and its aftermath, who had learned to be resourceful and observant, who had developed skills in reading between the lines of what people said and did. Their weekly sewing circle had been as much about sharing information and insights as about domestic crafts. Mrs. Fortescue nodded approvingly. "We should each think carefully about our last meeting with Constance, her words, her demeanor, her reactions to various topics of conversation. Perhaps together we can identify what was troubling her, and we should consider who else in the village might have had reason to want her silenced," Mrs. Swettenham added quietly, the words seeming to surprise her as she spoke them. The group agreed to meet again the following afternoon, not for sewing but for the more serious purpose of pooling their observations and memories. They would gather at Mrs. Bantry's house rather than returning to the village hall, which now felt contaminated by its association with violence and mystery. They walked home through the village in the gathering dusk. Each woman found herself looking at familiar surroundings with new eyes. The neat cottages with their well-tended gardens, the ancient church with its weathered stone walls, the high street with its comfortable shops, all seemed somehow different now that their world had been touched by the possibility of serious crime. Mrs. Bantry, walking alone toward the house she had shared with her late husband, found herself thinking about the nature of secrets in small communities. Every village harbored its share of hidden truths: affairs, financial difficulties, family scandals, old grudges that simmered beneath the surface of polite social interaction. Mrs. Hargreaves had been uniquely positioned to know many of these secrets, both through her late husband's legal practice and through her own keen observation of human nature. But knowledge, Mrs. Bantry reflected, could be a dangerous thing. In a community where reputation and social standing mattered enormously, where everyone depended on their neighbor's good opinion for both practical support and emotional well-being, someone who knew too much could become a threat that needed to be eliminated. As she reached her front gate, Mrs. Bantry paused to look back toward the church spire that dominated the village skyline. Somewhere behind that familiar landmark, Ivy Cottage sat dark and silent, keeping whatever secrets it might hold about the fate of its missing resident. By morning, those secrets might be revealed, but Mrs. Bantry had the uneasy feeling that the truth, when it came, would prove more disturbing than any of them yet imagined. The village settled into its evening routine as darkness fell, but the usual sense of peaceful security had been disturbed. In 6 different houses, 6 women sat by their fires or at their kitchen tables, thinking not about their sewing projects or their domestic concerns, but about bloodstains and missing neighbors and the uncomfortable realization that their safe, predictable world might not be as innocent as they had believed. Meanwhile, Jane Marple sat in her own cottage on the far side of the village green, entirely unaware of the afternoon's dramatic discoveries. She had spent the day tending her garden in preparation for winter, cutting back the last of the roses and covering the more delicate plants against the coming frost. Her arthritis had been troubling her more than usual, and she had retired early, with a cup of cocoa and the latest mystery novel from the travelling library. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple glanced out her bedroom window toward the village hall, noting absently that no lights showed in the building's windows. The sewing circle would have concluded their meeting hours ago, she knew, and the ladies would have returned to their respective homes to prepare dinner for their families or settle into their solitary evening routines. Miss Marple had been invited to join the sewing circle on several occasions, but had politely declined each time. Not from any lack of social inclination, she enjoyed the company of her neighbors and was genuinely fond of several of the ladies involved, but because she preferred her independence and found that group activities sometimes constrained her natural tendency toward observation and analysis. She had noticed, however, that the sewing circle had become an important institution in village life, serving not just as a social gathering, but as an informal information exchange where news, concerns, and observations were shared among some of the most perceptive women in the community. Mrs. Hargreaves, in particular, had established herself as a valuable source of historical knowledge and social insight. As she settled beneath her quilts, Miss Marple reflected on the curious fact that she had not encountered Mrs. Hargreaves during her recent walks around the village. The widow was normally quite visible in the community, attending church services, shopping at the grocer's, maintaining her garden, taking regular constitutional walks along the country lanes that surrounded St. Mary Mead. Her absence from these usual activities had been subtle enough to escape specific notice, but now that Miss Marple considered the matter, she realized she had not seen Constance Hargreaves for several days. Perhaps the woman was simply indisposed or had travelled to visit family. But Miss Marple's long experience with human nature had taught her to pay attention to subtle changes in established patterns. In a village where everyone knew everyone else's habits and routines, unexplained absences often signaled troubles that were being kept carefully hidden from public view. She made a mental note to inquire about Mrs. Hargreaves's welfare in the morning, perhaps by stopping at the cottage behind the church, under the pretext of borrowing a gardening book she knew the widow possessed. It was always better to investigate small concerns before they developed into larger problems. But as Miss Marple drifted off to sleep, she had no way of knowing that her services as an investigator would soon be desperately needed, that the sewing circle's discovery of the bloodstain had already set in motion a chain of events that would test all her skills in observation, deduction, and understanding of human nature. Morning came to St. Mary Mead with the crisp clarity of late autumn, the air sharp with the promise of winter, and the smell of wood smoke from cottage chimneys. The village stirred to life with its usual rhythm, the postman making his rounds, children walking to school, housewives emerging to tend their gardens or visit the shops on the high street. But beneath this facade of normalcy, an undercurrent of tension ran through the community like water through underground springs. The 6 members of the sewing circle had each spent a restless night thinking about bloodstains and missing neighbors, and their anxiety began to infect the broader village consciousness in the subtle ways that characterize small communities. Mrs. Bantry, who had always been an early riser, was in her garden before 7 o'clock, ostensibly to gather the last vegetables before the frost, but actually because she could not bear to remain inside with her troubled thoughts. As she worked among the remaining cabbages and leeks, she found herself glancing frequently toward the church spire, and wondering what Constable Polk might have discovered during his visit to Ivy Cottage the previous evening. Her gardening was interrupted by the appearance of Miss Fullerton, who had taken an unusually early walk and now stood at the garden gate with the purposeful expression of someone who had news to share. The retired schoolmistress's steel-rimmed spectacles glinted in the morning sun as she surveyed Mrs. Bantry's vegetable patch with the same methodical attention she had once applied to her pupil's arithmetic. "Good morning, Mrs. Bantry," Miss Fullerton said, her voice carrying the slight formality that always characterized her public speech. "I hope you slept better than I did." "Not particularly well, I'm afraid," Mrs. Bantry replied, straightening from her work and brushing soil from her gardening gloves. "I kept thinking about yesterday's discoveries. Have you learned anything more?" Miss Fullerton glanced around to ensure they were not overheard, then leaned closer to the garden gate. "I walked past Ivy Cottage this morning. The curtains are still drawn and there's no smoke from the chimney. Either Mrs. Hargreaves is still absent or—" She paused, unwilling to voice the alternative. "Did you see any sign of Constable Polk's investigation?" "That's what's so troubling," Miss Fullerton replied. "I encountered young Tommy Fletcher delivering newspapers, and he mentioned that the constable had been at the cottage until quite late last evening. Tommy saw him leaving after 9 o'clock, and he looked right serious, according to the boy. This news confirmed Mrs. Bantry's growing fears. If Constable Polk had spent several hours at the cottage and emerged looking serious, the situation was almost certainly more grave than a simple case of illness or unexpected travel. The blood stain in the village hall was beginning to seem ominously connected to Mrs. Hargreaves's absence. "We should gather the others," Mrs. Bantry decided. "If something has happened to Constance, we need to pool our knowledge and observations. The constable is a good man, but he doesn't know village life the way we do." Miss Fullerton nodded approvingly. "I'll speak with Mrs. Fortescue and Mrs. Dixon. Can you contact the others?" By mid-morning, the 6 women had reassembled, not in the contaminated atmosphere of the village hall, but in Mrs. Bantry's comfortable sitting room, with its chintz-covered chairs and warming fire. The domestic setting provided some comfort, but could not entirely dispel the anxiety that had settled over the group like fog over the moors. Mrs. Fortescue, who had stopped at the grocer's before coming to the meeting, brought disturbing news. Mr. Fortescue mentioned that Constable Polk had been asking questions about Mrs. Hargreaves, when she was last seen, who her friends were, whether she'd had any recent disputes with neighbours. The constable also requested the key to her cottage from Mrs. Price, who does the cleaning. Then he found evidence of something, young Mrs. Kimball said quietly, her face pale with anxiety. "People don't simply vanish without trace, do they? There must be some explanation." Mrs. Swettenham, who had been unusually silent even for her, suddenly spoke up. "There is an explanation. We're just not seeing it clearly because we don't want to believe it." She looked around at her companions with uncharacteristic directness. "Someone hurt Constance, possibly killed her, and did it in or near the village hall where we meet every week. The blood on the floor proves violence occurred, and her absence proves she was the victim." The blunt statement sent a chill through the room that even the warming fire could not dispel. Faced with such direct acknowledgement of their fears, the women found themselves confronting the reality that their peaceful village had been touched by serious crime. Mrs. Bantry, drawing on reserves of strength developed during her years as a doctor's wife, addressed the group with calm authority. "If that's true, and I fear it may be, then we have a responsibility to help identify whoever did this terrible thing. Constance was our friend, and we knew her better than anyone else in the village. We must think systematically about who might have wanted to harm her and why. The suggestion galvanized the group into constructive action. These were women who had lived through a war, who had learned to organize, analyze, and take decisive action when circumstances demanded it. Their weekly sewing circle had been as much about sharing information and observations as about domestic crafts, and now they could apply those same skills to a far more serious purpose. Miss Fullerton, with her teacher's instinct for systematic analysis, suggested they begin by examining Mrs. Hargreaves's recent behavior and comments. We all agreed yesterday that she seemed different during our last meeting. Frightened, distracted, preoccupied. Let's try to recall exactly what she said and did that afternoon. The women settled into their chairs and began the process of collective recollection, each contributing details from her memory of the previous Tuesday's gathering. Gradually, a picture emerged of a woman who had indeed been troubled by something specific, not the general anxieties that occasionally affected everyone, but a focused concern that had disrupted her usual confident demeanor. Mrs. Dixon, the vicar's wife, remembered that Mrs. Hargreaves had arrived later than usual and had seemed reluctant to settle into her customary chair. She kept glancing toward the windows, as if she expected to see someone watching from outside. Most unlike her usual manner. She's normally so composed and assured. And she barely touched her tea, Mrs. Fortescue added. Constance has always been particular about her tea, but that afternoon she let her cup sit untouched while it grew cold. I noticed because it seemed so out of character. Young Mrs. Kimball contributed a detail that now seemed ominous in retrospect. When I mentioned seeing a stranger in the village, a man I didn't recognize walking near the church, Mrs. Hargreaves became quite agitated. She asked several questions about his appearance, where exactly I'd seen him, what time of day it had been. Her reaction seemed quite disproportionate to such an innocent observation. Mrs. Swettenham nodded slowly. I remember that exchange. Mrs. Hargreaves's hands were actually trembling when she asked those questions. She tried to hide it by keeping busy with her sewing, but I noticed because I'm familiar with nervous hands myself. This revelation added a new dimension to their understanding of Mrs. Hargreaves's final appearance at the sewing circle. She had not merely been generally anxious or preoccupied. She had been specifically frightened by the possibility that a particular person might be in the vicinity. The stranger Mrs. Kimball had observed near the church had clearly held some special significance for the missing woman. Miss Fullerton, her analytical mind working through the implications, posed the crucial question: did any of the rest of you see this stranger? Can we piece together a more complete description? The women searched their memories, but none of them could recall encountering an unfamiliar man near the church during the relevant time period. Mrs. Kimball herself could provide only a vague description: medium height, dark coat, walking with purpose rather than the casual pace of a tourist or casual visitor. I only saw him from a distance, she explained apologetically, and I didn't think to pay close attention until Mrs. Hargreaves reacted so strongly to my mention of him. By then he had disappeared down one of the side lanes. Mrs. Bantry made a mental note to share this information with Constable Polk when opportunity arose. The presence of an unidentified stranger in the village, combined with Mrs. Hargreaves's frightened reaction to news of him, suggested a connection that the police should investigate. But their analysis was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps on the front path. Through the sitting-room window, they could see Constable Polk walking toward the house with the measured pace of a man bearing serious news. His expression was grave, and he carried his official notebook in a way that suggested he had important information to record. Mrs. Bantry rose to admit him, her heart beating faster as she prepared to hear confirmation of her worst fears. The constable removed his helmet as he entered the sitting-room, nodding respectfully to the assembled women before addressing them with the formal courtesy that characterized his professional manner. Ladies, I'm afraid I have disturbing news to share. My investigation of Mrs. Hargreaves's cottage has revealed evidence of a struggle. Furniture overturned, broken crockery, and signs that someone left the premises under duress. There's no indication that Mrs. Hargreaves departed voluntarily. The words fell into the room like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and dismay that touched each woman differently. Mrs. Dixon pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a small cry, while Miss Fullerton's face went pale behind her steel-rimmed spectacles. Young Mrs. Kimball began to tremble, and Mrs. Swetnam's nervous hands twisted the fabric of her dress. Only Mrs. Fortescue and Mrs. Bantry maintained their composure, though both women's faces reflected the gravity of the constable's revelation. As women who had assumed leadership roles in their community, they understood that someone needed to ask the practical questions and help coordinate whatever assistance might be needed. "Have you found any trace of Mrs. Hargreaves herself?" Mrs. Bantry inquired, though she dreaded the answer. "Not yet," Constable Polk replied. "But I've contacted the county authorities and they're sending additional investigators. This matter is beyond what our local resources can handle effectively." He paused, studying the faces of the 6 women with the careful attention of someone who understood that they possessed crucial information about the victim and the community where the crime had occurred. "I need to ask you ladies to think very carefully about Mrs. Hargreaves's recent behavior, her concerns, her relationships with other residents. Someone in this village knows why she was targeted, and that knowledge may be essential to finding her, or to finding whoever took her." Miss Fullerton straightened in her chair with the bearing of someone preparing to fulfill an important duty. "We've been discussing exactly those matters, Constable. We've identified several concerning patterns in Constance's behavior during our last meeting with her." She proceeded to share their collective observations. Mrs. Hargreaves's obvious anxiety, her preoccupation with the windows, her strong reaction to news of a stranger in the village, her general demeanor of someone who felt threatened. The constable made careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. When Miss Fullerton mentioned the unidentified man Mrs. Kimball had observed near the church, Constable Polk's attention sharpened noticeably. "Can you provide any additional details about this stranger's appearance or behavior?" Mrs. Kimball repeated her limited description, apologizing again for not having observed more carefully at the time. But her account, though brief, clearly interested. The constable, who made extensive notes and asked several follow-up questions about timing, location, and the stranger's apparent direction of travel. "This information is very helpful," he assured the group. "We'll be canvassing the village to see if anyone else noticed this individual or can provide additional details about his identity or purpose in St. Mary Mead." Mrs. Fortescue, who had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, raised a practical question that had been troubling her. "Constable, should we be concerned for our own safety? If someone has harmed Constance, and if that person is still in the village—" "That's a very reasonable concern," he replied gravely. "Until we understand who did this and why, I'd recommend that all residents take basic precautions. Travel in pairs when possible, keep doors locked, be alert for anything unusual or suspicious." The advice sent a chill through the group. St. Mary Mead was the sort of village where doors were rarely locked, and residents felt perfectly safe walking alone at any hour. The idea that they now needed to take precautions against violence from their own neighbors represented a fundamental change in their way of life. As Constable Polk prepared to leave, he turned back to the women with a final request. "If you remember anything else, any detail from your recent interactions with Mrs. Hargreaves, any observations about other residents' behavior, anything that seemed unusual or out of place, please contact me immediately. In cases like this, seemingly minor details often prove crucial." After his departure, The 6 women sat in subdued silence, each grappling with the implications of what they had learned. The bloodstain in the village hall, Mrs. Hargreaves's violent disappearance, the presence of an unidentified stranger, all these elements painted a picture of deliberate harm that seemed almost impossible to reconcile with their peaceful village environment. Mrs. Bantry was the first to voice what they were all thinking. We can't simply wait passively for the authorities to solve this. Constance was our friend, and we knew her better than anyone else. If we don't help find the truth, who will? The suggestion resonated with the group's desire to take constructive action. These were women who had learned during wartime not to rely entirely on official authorities, who had developed skills in observation, analysis, and practical problem-solving. That could prove valuable in their current crisis. Miss Fullerton nodded approvingly. We should systematically examine what we know about village relationships and recent changes that might have created conflicts or tensions. Constance's knowledge of local affairs made her valuable, but it might also have made her dangerous to someone with secrets to hide. But where do we begin? Young Mrs. Kimball asked. Everyone in the village has secrets of some sort, family troubles, financial difficulties, old grievances. How do we determine which ones might have led to violence? The question highlighted the central challenge they faced. Village life was a complex web of interconnected relationships, shared histories, hidden resentments, and carefully maintained facades. Mrs. Hargreaves had possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of this social landscape, but her disappearance had removed their most informed guide to the very information they now needed most desperately. Mrs. Swettenham, who rarely offered suggestions but observed everything with quiet intensity, spoke up with surprising confidence. We start with the newcomers. Constance was specifically concerned about the new family moving into Rose Cottage, and she reacted strongly to news of a stranger in the village. Perhaps her knowledge of local history told her something about these people that the rest of us don't know. The suggestion made excellent sense. Mrs. Hargreaves's position as the widow of the village solicitor had given her access to property records, legal documents, and family histories that ordinary residents would not possess. If the new arrivals at Rose Cottage had connections to previous problems in St. Mary Mead, she would have been uniquely positioned to recognize those connections. Mrs. Fortescue, ever practical, proposed a plan of action. We should learn everything. Weaken about the Ashford family, where they came from, why they chose our village, what Mr. Ashford's business in the city involves. If they're connected to previous residents who caused difficulties, those connections might explain Constance's concerns. And we should try to identify the stranger Mrs. Kimball observed, Mrs. Bantry added. If he was connected to the Ashfords, or if he represented some threat that Constance recognized, finding him might lead us to the truth. The women agreed to divide these investigative tasks among themselves, using their various social connections and positions in the community to gather information discreetly. Mrs. Fortescue would use her husband's business relationships to learn about Mr. Ashford's professional activities. Mrs. Dixon would consult the church records and speak with the vicar about the family's background. Miss Fullerton would examine the property transfer documents at the village hall, where such records were kept for public reference. Mrs. Bantry would visit Rose Cottage directly, under the pretext of welcoming the new family to the community, a traditional courtesy that would provide opportunities for observation and casual questioning. Mrs. Kimball would canvass other residents to see if anyone else had noticed the mysterious stranger, while Mrs. Swettenham would use her quiet, unobtrusive manner to listen for gossip and speculation that might reveal additional information. As they prepared to begin their unofficial investigation, each woman understood that they were venturing into potentially dangerous territory. If Mrs. Hargreaves had indeed been harmed because of her knowledge of village secrets, then pursuing those same secrets might put them at similar risk. but their sense of loyalty to their missing friend, combined with their determination to restore safety and peace to their community, outweighed their natural caution. They had lived through a war and its aftermath. They had learned to face dangers and take necessary actions, even when the outcomes were uncertain. As the group dispersed to begin their respective tasks, Mrs. Bantry walked alone toward Rose Cottage, thinking about the nature of secrets and the price people sometimes paid for possessing dangerous knowledge. The cottage sat at the edge of the village, surrounded by the overgrown garden that old Mr. Weatherby had neglected during his final years. The new owners had begun to restore the property, but their efforts had not yet erased the slightly forlorn atmosphere that clung to houses that had been empty too long. Mrs. Bantry approached the front door with the confident manner of a woman fulfilling a social obligation, but her observant eyes noted details that might prove significant. Expensive, luggage visible through a window, a London newspaper folded on the front step, a child's bicycle that seemed too large for the toddler she had seen with the family during their brief previous encounters. Mrs. Ashford answered the door herself, a well-dressed woman in her 30s, with the slightly strained expression of someone adjusting to new surroundings. She welcomed Mrs. Bantry's visit with the polite enthusiasm of someone eager to establish good relationships with her neighbors, inviting her into a sitting room that still smelled of fresh paint and new furniture. "How kind of you to call," Mrs. Ashford said, bustling about to prepare tea with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to managing household duties. "We're still settling in, but we're so pleased to be part of such a lovely community." Mrs. Bantry accepted the tea and settled into polite conversation about village life, local shops, church services, and other topics that allowed her to observe her hostess while gathering potentially useful information. Mrs. Ashford seemed genuinely pleasant and eager to integrate into local society, but there were subtle signs of tension beneath her friendly manner, a tendency to glance toward the windows, a slight hesitation before answering certain questions, an occasional tightness around her eyes that suggested worry or anxiety. "My husband travels quite frequently for his business," Mrs. Ashford explained when asked about her family's routines. "Import and export, rather complicated arrangements that require him to maintain offices both here and on the continent. We chose this location partly because the railway connections make his travel easier." The explanation sounded reasonable, but Mrs. Bantry noted that it was delivered with the careful precision of someone who had prepared and rehearsed the response. There was nothing necessarily suspicious about such preparation. Many people found it helpful to have standard explanations for their circumstances, but it suggested that the Ashfords had given considerable thought to how they presented themselves to their new community. When Mrs. Bantry mentioned Mrs. Hargreaves's extensive knowledge of local history, Mrs. Ashford's reaction was subtle but noticeable. A slight pause, a momentary tightening of her grip on her teacup, a too casual question about whether the widow was someone she should meet as part of becoming acquainted with village society. "Oh, everyone should know Constance," Mrs. Bantry replied warmly, watching for any further reaction. "She's quite the authority on village affairs and family histories. I'm sure she'll call on you soon. She's always interested in learning about new residents and their connections to the area." Mrs. Ashford's smile remained in place, but Mrs. Bantry detected a flicker of something that might have been concern or even fear. The reaction was so brief and well concealed that she might have missed it entirely if she had not been watching specifically for signs of unease. The visit concluded with mutual expressions of pleasure at the acquaintance and invitations for future social contact, but as Mrs. Bantry walked home through the village lanes, she found herself troubled by subtle inconsistencies in Mrs. Ashford's manner and responses. The woman had seemed genuinely pleasant and eager to fit into village life, yet there had been underlying tensions that suggested all was not as straightforward as it appeared. Meanwhile, across the village, Miss Fullerton was pursuing her own line of investigation at the village hall, where property records and other local documents were kept in a small office adjacent to the main meeting room. As a former schoolmistress with a reputation for meticulous research, she had no difficulty obtaining access to the relevant files from Mrs. Price, who served as the hall's part-time administrator. The property transfer documents for Rose Cottage revealed interesting details about the transaction. The Ashfords had purchased the property through a London solicitor, paying cash rather than arranging a mortgage, an unusual circumstance that suggested either considerable wealth or a desire to avoid the detailed financial scrutiny that mortgage applications required. More intriguing still, the previous owner's record showed that old Mr. Weatherby had inherited the cottage from a distant relative nearly 40 years earlier. The original owner had been a Mr. Gerald Morrison, who had apparently left the village abruptly in the early 1900s, under circumstances that were not clearly documented in the official records. Miss Fullerton made careful notes of these details, sensing that the property's history might hold significance she could not yet fully understand. Mrs. Hargreaves, with her encyclopedic knowledge of village affairs and her late husband's legal files, would certainly have been aware of any unusual circumstances surrounding Rose Cottage and its various owners. As she walked home with her notebook full of potentially important information, Miss Fullerton found herself wondering whether Mrs. Hargreaves's concerns about the new residents might have been based on her knowledge of the cottage's history rather than any specific information about the Ashford family themselves. Perhaps she had recognized some pattern or connection that linked the current situation to past problems in the village. The afternoon's investigations had raised more questions than they answered, but the 6 women of the sewing circle were beginning to assemble a picture of circumstances that might explain their friend's disappearance. The presence of newcomers with potentially hidden motivations, combined with Mrs. Hargreaves's unique knowledge of local history and her obvious fear of some specific threat, suggested connections that needed to be explored further. As evening settled over St. Mary Mead, the village maintained its facade of peaceful normalcy, but beneath the surface, currents of tension and suspicion were beginning to flow. The discovery of violence in their midst had shattered the community's sense of security, and until the truth was revealed, no one could feel entirely safe. In her cottage on the far side of the village green, Miss Jane Marple was beginning to take notice of the subtle changes in the community's atmosphere. Her afternoon walk had taken her past groups of residents engaged in hushed conversations that ceased when she approached, past houses where curtains twitched at windows as neighbors watched the street with unusual vigilance, past the village hall where she noticed that someone had placed a lock on the front door that had never been locked in living memory. Miss Marple possessed a finely tuned sensitivity to the rhythms and patterns of village life, developed through years of quiet observation and reflection on human nature. The current atmosphere of suppressed anxiety and hidden knowledge was unmistakable to someone with her experience, even though she had not yet learned the specific details of recent events. As she prepared her simple dinner and settled by her fire with her knitting, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the nature of secrets and the ways they could poison the atmosphere of even the most peaceful community. Every village harbored its share of hidden truths, financial difficulties, family scandals, old grievances that simmered beneath the surface of polite social interaction, but usually these secrets remained safely buried, causing no more than occasional minor discomfort when circumstances brought them briefly to light. When secrets became dangerous, when they threatened to destroy reputations or reveal criminal behavior, they could drive people to desperate actions. Miss Marple had observed this pattern in various communities over the years, and she recognized the warning signs of a situation where hidden knowledge had become a weapon that someone was willing to kill to keep concealed. Her musings were interrupted by a soft knock at her front door. Opening it, she found Mrs. Clement from the house next door, a pleasant woman in her 50s who served as the village's unofficial coordinator of charitable activities and social events. "Good evening, Miss Marple," Mrs. Clement said, her usual cheerful demeanor subdued by obvious worry. "I hope I'm not disturbing your evening, but I wondered if you might have heard about the troubles at the village hall," Miss Marple invited her neighbor inside, and listened with growing concern as Mrs. Clement shared what she had learned through the village's informal communication network. The discovery of the bloodstain, Mrs. Hargreaves's disappearance, the evidence of violence at Ivy Cottage, all these details painted a picture of serious crime that explained the community's current atmosphere of fearful tension. "The sewing circle ladies are quite beside themselves," Mrs. Clement explained. "Constance was such a fixture in village life, and the idea that someone might have harmed her deliberately is almost impossible to accept. Yet the evidence seems clear enough." Miss Marple listened thoughtfully, her knitting needles moving in a steady rhythm that helped her think through complex problems. The pattern of events Mrs. Clement described was indeed disturbing, but certain aspects of the situation particularly caught her attention. "You mentioned that Mrs. Hargreaves seemed frightened during her last appearance at the sewing circle," Miss Marple observed. "Had there been any recent changes in the village that might have caused such anxiety?" Mrs. Clement considered the question carefully. "The only significant change has been the arrival of the new family at Rose Cottage, the Ashfords, but they seem perfectly pleasant, and I can't imagine why their presence would distress Constance." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "but sometimes new arrivals can trigger memories of old problems, especially for someone with Mrs. Hargreaves's extensive knowledge of local history. She might have recognized some pattern or connection that wasn't obvious to the rest of us." The suggestion intrigued Mrs. Clement, who possessed her own considerable knowledge of village affairs through her charitable work and social activities. "You know, now that you mention it, Constance did seem particularly interested in learning about the Ashfords' background. She asked me several questions about where they had come from and what had brought them to our village." "And what did you learn about their background?" "Very little, actually. They mentioned London, of course, and some connection to business on the continent. Mr. Ashford travels frequently, and they chose our village partly for its railway connections. But beyond those general details—" Mrs. Clement paused, frowning, as she considered the matter. "Come to think of it, they were rather vague about specifics, pleasant and polite, but not particularly forthcoming about their previous circumstances." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. In her experience, people who were genuinely innocent and straightforward about their affairs rarely hesitated to share reasonable details about their backgrounds and circumstances. Excessive vagueness or reluctance to discuss the past often indicated secrets that required concealment. "Have the authorities been notified of Mrs. Hargreaves's disappearance?" she inquired. "Oh yes, Constable Polk is investigating, and he's requested assistance from the county police. But you know how these official investigations proceed, slowly and methodically following proper procedures. Meanwhile, Constance might be—" Mrs. Clement couldn't bring herself to voice her worst fears. Miss Marple understood her neighbor's frustration and anxiety. Official investigations were indeed necessary, and ultimately more likely to produce legally actionable results, but they sometimes lacked the intimate knowledge of local relationships and hidden dynamics that could prove crucial in cases involving small communities. "Perhaps," she suggested gently, "there are ways the residents themselves might assist the authorities by sharing their knowledge of Mrs. Hargreaves's concerns and recent behavior. The ladies of the sewing circle, in particular, would have observed her most closely in recent weeks." Mrs. Clement's face brightened slightly. "Actually, I believe they're planning to do exactly that. Mrs. Bantry mentioned that they intend to pool their observations and memories to see if they can identify any patterns or connections that might explain what happened. Miss Marple approved of this approach, though she hoped the well-meaning ladies would be careful not to put themselves in danger by pursuing leads that might prove hazardous. Amateur investigators, however well-intentioned, sometimes lacked the experience to recognize when their activities might attract unwelcome attention from the very people they were trying to identify. After Mrs. Clement departed, Miss Marple sat by her fire, thinking about the complex web of relationships, secrets, and hidden motivations that characterized every small community. Mrs. Hargreaves's disappearance was clearly connected to her extensive knowledge of local affairs, but determining which specific piece of information had proven dangerous would require careful analysis of recent changes and tensions in village life. The arrival of the Ashford family at Rose Cottage seemed the most obvious catalyst, but Miss Marple's experience had taught her to be wary of the most obvious explanations. Sometimes the apparent cause of trouble was merely a coincidence that had revealed deeper problems, or a deliberate diversion designed to conceal the true source of danger. As she prepared for bed, Miss Marple made a mental decision to become more actively involved in observing the current situation. Her natural inclination toward discretion and her reputation as a harmless elderly lady who enjoyed gardening and knitting made her an ideal observer of human behavior. People rarely guarded their words or actions carefully in her presence, assuming that she was too naive or disinterested to understand the significance of what she witnessed. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin her own quiet investigation of recent events in St. Mary Mead, not to interfere with official police work, but to observe and analyze the subtle patterns of human behavior that might reveal truths that formal questioning could not uncover. The next morning brought a heavy fog that seemed to muffle both sound and spirit throughout the village. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and spent the pre-dawn hours tending her garden and preparing for a day of careful observation. The fog provided excellent cover for discreet movement around the village, allowing her to position herself for unobtrusive watching and listening. Her first destination was the small lane behind the church that led to Ivy Cottage. She wanted to observe the scene of Mrs. Hargreaves's apparent abduction for herself, not to disturb any evidence, but to gain a better understanding of the physical circumstances that might have contributed to the crime. The cottage stood silent and apparently empty, with official police tape across the front door and chalk marks on the ground that indicated where evidence had been collected. Miss Marple studied the scene with the careful attention of someone who understood that physical details often revealed important truths about the sequence of events and the motivations of those involved. The cottage's isolated location, accessible only by a narrow lane that was rarely used by casual passers-by, would have provided privacy for anyone who wished to approach Mrs. Hargreaves without being observed. At the same time, its position behind the church meant that sounds of struggle or distress might have been muffled by the substantial stone walls of the ancient building. Miss Marple noted the condition of the small front garden, which showed signs of recent disturbance beyond what the police investigation would have caused. Plants were crushed, soil was scattered, and there were marks in the earth that suggested a wheeled vehicle had approached the cottage recently, possibly to remove something or someone under cover of darkness. As she stood examining these details, Miss Marple became aware of being watched. Turning slightly, she glimpsed a figure standing at one of the upper windows of Rose Cottage, which was visible from this angle across the intervening fields. The distance was too great for her to identify the watcher clearly, but something about the stillness and intensity of their posture suggested more than casual curiosity about her activities. The observation was brief. When she looked again, moments later the figure had vanished, but it confirmed her growing suspicion that the Ashford family's arrival in St. Mary Mead was somehow connected to recent events. Innocent newcomers would have no particular reason to watch covertly, while neighbours examined the scene of a local crime. Miss Marple left the area by a circuitous route that took her past Rose Cottage itself, where she paused to examine the property, with the apparent casualness of someone taking a morning constitutional. The house showed signs of recent occupancy: smoke from the chimney, curtains open to let in light, a newspaper on the front step. But there was something artificially normal about these domestic details, as if they had been arranged deliberately to create an impression of ordinary family life. Her circuit of the village brought her eventually to Mrs. Bantry's house, where she found the former doctor's wife working in her garden with the determined energy of someone who needed physical activity to manage anxiety. Mrs. Bantry looked up from her digging with the expression of surprise and pleasure at seeing Miss Marple. "Good morning," she called, straightening from her work and brushing soil from her gardening gloves. "You're out early today." "I find the morning air beneficial for thinking," Miss Marple replied, approaching the garden gate. "I heard from Mrs. Clement about your friend's disappearance. Such a disturbing situation for the entire village." Mrs. Bantry nodded grimly. "Indeed it is. Constance is such an integral part of our community. The idea that someone might have harmed her deliberately is almost incomprehensible. Yet the evidence suggests violence occurred," Miss Marple observed gently. "Have you and your friends been able to identify any specific concerns or fears that Mrs. Hargreaves might have expressed recently?" The question touched on exactly the matters that Mrs. Bantry and the sewing circle had been discussing, and she found herself grateful to share her worries with someone of Miss Marple's reputation for wisdom and discretion. She provided a careful summary of their collective observations. Mrs. Hargreaves's obvious anxiety during their last meeting, her reaction to news of a stranger in the village, her particular concern about the new family at Rose Cottage. Miss Marple listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that seemingly minor details often held the keys to understanding complex situations. Mrs. Bantry's account confirmed her own growing suspicion that the Ashford family's arrival had served as a catalyst for events that were rooted in older and deeper secrets. "You mentioned that Mrs. Hargreaves possessed extensive knowledge of village history," Miss Marple said. "Had she ever spoken specifically about Rose Cottage or its previous owners?" Mrs. Bantry paused in her gardening to consider the question. "Not in any detail, though I know she was familiar with the property's history through her late husband's legal practice. Old Mr. Weatherby had inherited the cottage from a relative many years ago, someone who had left the village rather suddenly, as I recall." "Left suddenly?" Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Do you remember any details about the circumstances of that departure?" "I'm afraid not. It happened long before I came to the village, and Constance only mentioned it in passing on some occasion when we were discussing local property. But she had that particular expression she got when she was thinking about unpleasant episodes from the past. You know how some people look when they're remembering something they'd rather forget." Miss Marple did indeed know that expression, having observed it countless times in people who carried knowledge of old scandals, family secrets, or criminal behaviors that had never been fully resolved. Such knowledge could remain harmless for years or decades, until circumstances arose that made it dangerous to possess. "Have you had an opportunity to meet the new residents yourself?" she inquired. "I called on Mrs. Ashford yesterday," Mrs. Bantry replied. "She seemed pleasant enough, though there was something, I can't quite define it, a sense that she was being very careful about what she said and how she presented herself. Not necessarily suspicious, but perhaps overly concerned about making the right impression." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. In her experience, people who were genuinely innocent and straightforward about their circumstances rarely displayed such careful self-monitoring in casual social interactions. Excessive concern about impressions often indicated secrets that required concealment, or past experiences that had taught wariness in dealing with neighbours and authorities. As she continued her morning walk, Miss Marple reflected on the pattern of information she was gathering. Mrs. Hargreaves's disappearance seemed clearly connected to her knowledge of local history and her recognition of some threat represented by recent changes in the village. The Ashford family's arrival, particularly their connection to Rose Cottage with its history of sudden departures and unresolved questions, appeared to have triggered fears that had ultimately led to violence. But the specific nature of the threat remained unclear. Was Mrs. Hargreaves killed to prevent her from revealing information about the Ashfords' true identity or criminal background? Had she recognized someone from the past who had returned to the village under false pretenses? Or was the connection more complex, involving multiple parties and older secrets that were now threatening to surface? Miss Marple's contemplation was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps on the fog-dampened lane. A man emerged from the mist, walking toward her with the purposeful stride of someone who knew exactly where he was going. As he drew closer, she could see that he was a stranger. Medium height, dark coat with the kind of nondescript appearance that could easily be forgotten unless one made a deliberate effort to remember specific details. This, she realized, must be the mysterious figure that Mrs. Kimball had observed near the church and that had caused such a strong reaction from Mrs. Hargreaves. His presence in the village clearly was not coincidental, and his early morning walk suggested either legitimate business that required privacy or activities that were best conducted when few witnesses were about. Miss Marple nodded politely as they passed each other, noting without apparent interest the man's nervous glance toward Rose Cottage and his obvious relief at encountering only a harmless elderly lady during his secretive morning activities. She continued her walk without looking back, but her sharp ears caught the sound of his footsteps turning down the lane that led toward the railway station. The encounter provided another piece of evidence that supported her growing theory about the connections between Mrs. Hargreaves's disappearance and the arrival of the Ashford family. The mysterious stranger's presence, his obvious familiarity with the village layout, and his apparent coordination with the residents of Rose Cottage suggested a planned operation rather than a series of coincidental events. By the time Miss Marple returned to her cottage, she had developed a preliminary theory about recent events that would require careful testing through additional observation and analysis. If she was correct, Mrs. Hargreaves had been eliminated, not because of any immediate threat she posed, but because her knowledge of past events had made her capable of recognizing a carefully planned deception that was now unfolding in St. Mary. Mead. The fog began to lift as the morning progressed, revealing a village that looked deceptively normal, despite the currents of tension and fear that ran beneath its peaceful surface. Miss Marple settled in her sitting room with her knitting and positioned herself where she could observe the street through her front window, while appearing to be absorbed in domestic activities. Over the next several hours, she noted patterns of movement and behavior that confirmed her suspicions about the artificial nature of recent events. The Ashford family's activities seemed carefully choreographed to create impressions of normal domestic life, but the timing and sequence of their appearances suggested performance rather than genuine routine. More tellingly, the mysterious stranger made 2 more appearances during the day, each time walking purposefully toward Rose Cottage and remaining there for precisely the length of time that would indicate brief business meetings rather than social visits. His routes through the village were obviously chosen to avoid main streets and areas where he might encounter curious residents. As afternoon approached, Miss Marple observed the 6 members of the sewing circle converging on Mrs. Bantry's house for what was clearly another meeting to discuss their investigation of Mrs. Hargreaves's disappearance. Their worried expressions and secretive manner suggested they had uncovered additional information that increased rather than diminished their concerns about their missing friend. Miss Marple made a decision that went against her usual preference for indirect observation. The situation had progressed to a point where active intervention might be necessary to prevent additional violence and to ensure that the truth about Mrs. Hargreaves's fate was discovered before evidence could be destroyed or witnesses intimidated into silence. She set aside her knitting, gathered her coat and walking stick, and prepared to call upon the sewing circle ladies with an offer of assistance that she hoped they would have the wisdom to accept. Time was becoming a crucial factor, and amateur investigators, however well-intentioned, needed guidance from someone with more experience in recognizing and avoiding the dangers that accompanied criminal behavior. The walk to Mrs. Bantry's house took her past Rose Cottage once more, where she noted that all the curtains were now drawn despite the afternoon hour, an unusual circumstance that suggested the residents were either absent or deliberately avoiding observation. The lack of any signs of normal domestic activity, combined with the mysterious stranger's repeated visits, strengthened her conviction that the cottage was serving as a center for activities that required concealment from curious neighbors. Mrs. Bantry answered her knock with an expression of surprise that quickly transformed into welcome. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call. Please do come in. We're just having tea with the other ladies from our sewing circle." Miss Marple accepted the invitation and found herself in the sitting room with the 6 women who had discovered the bloodstain and were now struggling to understand their friend's disappearance. Their faces reflected a mixture of grief, anxiety, and determination that she recognized as the expression of people who had committed themselves to seeking justice, despite personal risk. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said as she settled into the chair Mrs. Bantry offered. "Mrs. Clement mentioned your terrible situation with Mrs. Hargreaves, and I wondered if there might be some way I could assist in your efforts to understand what happened." The offer was received with gratitude and relief. These women had been struggling with fears and suspicions that seemed too large and dangerous for their informal investigation, and Miss Marple's reputation for wisdom and discretion made her an ideal confidant for their discoveries. Miss Fullerton, as the group's most systematic thinker, provided a careful summary of their findings. The property records for Rose Cottage had revealed unusual circumstances surrounding both the current purchase and the previous ownership history. The original owner, Gerald Morrison, had departed the village suddenly in the early 1900s, under circumstances that were not clearly documented, but had apparently left lasting impressions on local memory. Mrs. Fortescue had learned through her husband's business connections that Mr. Ashford's import-export activities involved frequent travel to countries that were known for their banking secrecy laws and their willingness to accommodate financial arrangements that might not bear close scrutiny. While such activities were not necessarily criminal, they suggested the kind of lifestyle that might require careful concealment of one's true circumstances. Mrs. Bantry's visit to Rose Cottage had revealed subtle signs of tension beneath the family's pleasant facade, particularly Mrs. Ashford's carefully rehearsed responses to questions about their background and her obvious anxiety when Mrs. Hargreaves was mentioned as someone who would likely call upon them. Most disturbing of all, Mrs. Kimball's inquiries about the mysterious stranger had revealed that several other residents had noticed him, but had been reluctant to discuss his presence openly. His behavior suggested familiarity with the village layout and specific knowledge about schedules and routines that indicated careful advance planning rather than casual presence. Miss Marple listened to these reports with growing concern, not just about Mrs. Hargreaves's fate, but about the danger that the sewing circle members might be placing themselves in by pursuing their investigation. The pattern they were describing suggested organized criminal activity involving multiple participants, who had demonstrated their willingness to use violence to protect their interests. "You've gathered very important information," she told them. "But I'm concerned that your activities may have attracted unwelcome attention. People who are willing to harm Mrs. Hargreaves to protect their secrets will not hesitate to harm others who threaten their plans." The warning sent a chill through the group, but also strengthened their resolve to see their investigation through to completion. They had progressed too far and learned too much to abandon their efforts now, especially when their friend's life might still depend on discovering the truth quickly. Mrs. Swettenham, who had been unusually quiet during the discussion, suddenly spoke up with an observation that surprised the others. "I've been thinking about the timing of recent events, and I believe we're missing something important. Mrs. Hargreaves didn't just react to the arrival of the Ashford family. She reacted to something specific that she learned about them or recognized about their situation." The observation prompted the group to reconsider their assumptions about the sequence of events. Mrs. Hargreaves's anxiety during their last meeting had seemed connected to the newcomers, but perhaps she had discovered some specific information that revealed their true nature or purpose in coming to St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple encouraged this line of thinking. "What sort of information would Mrs. Hargreaves have had access to that the rest of you would not? What sources of knowledge about families and their histories were unique to her situation?" Miss Fullerton's eyes brightened behind her steel-rimmed spectacles as she grasped the implications of the question. Her late husband's legal files. As the village solicitor, he would have maintained records of property transactions, family disputes, criminal matters, all sorts of information that ordinary residents wouldn't possess. "And those files would still be in her cottage," Mrs. Bantry added. "Constance never threw away important documents. She maintained her husband's office exactly as it was when he died, filing new information according to his system." The realization that Mrs. Hargreaves's cottage might contain crucial evidence about the current situation created both excitement and anxiety among the group. If the police had not yet discovered the significance of the legal files, important information might still be available, but only if they could find a way to access it, without alerting the very people who had eliminated Mrs. Hargreaves to prevent such discoveries. Miss Marple considered the problem carefully. Constable Polk would need to be informed about the potential importance of those legal records, but approaching the cottage directly might be dangerous if the people responsible for Mrs. Hargreaves's disappearance are monitoring the area. Young Mrs. Kimball, who had been growing increasingly agitated throughout the discussion, suddenly stood up with an expression of determination that surprised her companions. "I can't bear sitting here talking while Constance might still be alive somewhere needing help. We have to take action, even if it's dangerous." Her words reflected the feelings of the entire group, but Miss Marple understood that emotional reactions, however well-intentioned, could lead to tragic mistakes when dealing with experienced criminals. She needed to channel their energy and determination into activities that would produce useful results without placing them in unnecessary danger. "There is something we can do," she said thoughtfully, "but it will require careful coordination and absolute discretion. We need to learn more about the true identity and purpose of the people at Rose Cottage, and we need to examine those legal files without alerting anyone to our activities." The plan she outlined was both simple and risky. Miss Marple would approach Constable Polk directly to share their discoveries and emphasize the potential importance of the legal records at Ivy Cottage. Meanwhile, the sewing circle members would maintain careful surveillance of Rose Cottage and its occupants, noting patterns of behavior and any contacts with outside parties. Most crucially, they would work together to reconstruct Mrs. Hargreaves's activities and state of mind during the days preceding her disappearance, trying to identify the specific information or recognition that had triggered her elimination. If they could understand what she had discovered, they might be able to anticipate the criminal's next moves and prevent additional violence. As the group prepared to implement this plan, Miss Marple emphasized the importance of maintaining normal routines and avoiding any behavior that might suggest they were conducting an investigation. These people have already demonstrated their willingness to use violence. We must assume they are watching for signs that their activities have aroused suspicion. The warning was timely, for at that very moment, the mysterious stranger was indeed observing Mrs. Bantry's house from a concealed position across the village green. He had noted the gathering of the sewing circle members and Miss Marple's arrival, and his trained eye recognized the intense discussion and planning session that was taking place within. His observations were reported immediately to the occupants of Rose Cottage, where the information was received with grim satisfaction. The amateur investigators were proceeding exactly as anticipated, gathering information and developing theories that would ultimately lead them into a carefully prepared trap. Their emotional attachment to their missing friend had made them predictably eager to take risks that more experienced investigators would have avoided. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would determine not only Mrs. Hargreaves's fate, but the safety of everyone in St. Mary Mead who had stumbled upon the truth about the criminal operation that had established itself in their peaceful village. The criminals had invested too much time and effort in their current plans to abandon them now, and they had already crossed the line into violence that made additional murders seem merely practical necessities. As evening approached, and the sewing circle members dispersed to their respective homes, each woman carried with her both determination to help their friend and growing awareness of the personal danger they now faced. They had committed themselves to a course of action that could not be abandoned, but they were beginning to understand that their amateur investigation had evolved into something far more serious than they had initially comprehended. Miss Marple walked home through streets that seemed deceptively normal in the gathering dusk. The familiar sights and sounds of village life, lighted windows, the smell of cooking dinners, children being called in from play, created an atmosphere of peaceful domesticity that belied the currents of violence and deception that now flowed beneath the surface of community life. But her trained eye noted details that confirmed her growing concerns about the situation. Too many curtains remained drawn at hours when residents normally welcomed the last light of day. Too many people moved with the hurried purpose of those who were anxious to complete their outdoor activities and retreat to the safety of locked doors. The village was adjusting to the presence of danger, even though most residents had not yet consciously acknowledged the nature of the threat they faced. At Rose Cottage, lights showed in the windows despite the drawn curtains, and Miss Marple caught glimpses of movement that suggested a larger number of occupants than the Ashford family alone would account for. The mysterious stranger was clearly staying in the house, and there might be others as well, associates or accomplices who had arrived to assist with whatever criminal operation was now approaching its crucial phase. Miss Marple's cottage provided an excellent vantage point for observing activities in this part of the village, and she positioned herself at her sitting-room window with her knitting and a cup of tea, settling in for an evening of careful surveillance. Her reputation as a harmless elderly lady who enjoyed quiet domestic pursuits made her observation activities virtually invisible to anyone who might be watching for signs of surveillance. Over the next several hours, she documented a pattern of movement and behavior that confirmed her worst fears about the situation. Rose Cottage was clearly serving as a center for organized criminal activity, with multiple participants arriving and departing under cover of darkness. The timing of these activities suggested coordination with train schedules and other transportation, arrangements that indicated careful planning and external support. Most ominously, one of the late-night arrivals brought what appeared to be digging tools and other equipment that might be used for concealing evidence or disposing of bodies. The possibility that Mrs. Hargreaves was already dead became more probable with each passing hour, though Miss Marple continued to hope that the criminals might be keeping her alive, pending the resolution of whatever situation had prompted their presence in St. Mary Mead. As midnight approached, Miss Marple prepared a careful written summary of her observations, along with a detailed analysis of the information the sewing circle had gathered and her own theories about the connections between recent events and older secrets in village history. This document would be crucial evidence if anything happened to her during the dangerous days ahead, and she wanted to ensure that Constable Polk and the county authorities would have access to all relevant information. The village settled into an uneasy quiet as residents retired for the night, but Miss Marple remained at her window, watching for activities that criminal operations typically conducted during the darkest hours before dawn. Her patience was rewarded near 3 o'clock in the morning, when several figures emerged from Rose Cottage, carrying what appeared to be a large, heavy bundle wrapped in canvas. The burden required 3 men to manage it, and their careful, coordinated movement suggested they were transporting something extremely important to their operation, possibly evidence that needed to be destroyed, or possibly Mrs. Hargreaves herself, alive or dead. They moved across the fields behind the cottage, heading toward an area of rough ground near the old quarry that had been abandoned for decades and was rarely visited by village residents. Miss Marple faced a crucial decision. She could remain safely at her window and hope that her written observations would eventually lead to justice, or she could follow the criminals and attempt to discover what they were concealing in the darkness. The choice carried enormous personal risk, but it might represent the only opportunity to save Mrs. Hargreaves, if she was still alive, or to ensure that crucial evidence was not destroyed if she was already dead. Drawing on reserves of courage that had sustained her through previous encounters with criminal behavior, Miss Marple gathered her coat and walking stick and prepared to venture into the night. She left her written analysis in a prominent position where it would be easily discovered if she failed to return, and she included specific instructions for Constable Polk about where to search for evidence and whom to arrest. The walk across the village to Rose Cottage and beyond to the quarry area required careful navigation in near-total darkness, with only occasional moonlight filtering through the clouds to illuminate her path. Miss Marple moved with the deliberate caution of someone who understood that a single misstep could result in discovery and certain death, but also with the determination of someone who had committed herself to seeing justice done regardless, to have personal cost. As she approached the quarry area, she could hear the sounds of digging and hushed conversation that confirmed the criminals were indeed burying something in the rough ground where discovery would be unlikely. The nature of their burden remained unclear, but the care they were taking to conceal it suggested either crucial evidence or a human body, possibly both. Miss Marple positioned herself behind a large boulder that provided concealment while allowing her to observe the burial activities. In the dim light, she could make out 3 male figures working systematically to create a deep hole in the rocky soil, while a 4th person supervised their efforts with the authority of someone in command of the operation. The supervisor's voice, when he spoke in low tones to coordinate the work, carried an accent that Miss Marple recognized as distinctly foreign, possibly German or Austrian, with the precise pronunciation of someone who had learned English as a second language, but spoke it fluently. This detail confirmed her growing suspicion that the criminals were international operatives rather than local villains, which explained both their professional competence and their willingness to eliminate obstacles without hesitation. As the digging progressed, Miss Marple realized that the hole was being prepared not just to conceal evidence, but to serve as a permanent burial site for multiple victims. The dimensions and depth suggested capacity for several bodies, which meant that Mrs. Hargreaves might not be the only person the criminals intended to eliminate before departing St. Mary Mead. The realization that she herself, along with the members of the sewing circle, were almost certainly targeted for elimination, gave new urgency to her mission. She needed to gather enough information to ensure that justice could be served, even if none of the current witnesses survived to testify, and she needed to find some way to alert the authorities before the criminals could complete their plans. But her surveillance was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps behind her hiding place. Someone else was moving through the darkness toward the quarry, and Miss Marple found herself caught between the digging party ahead of her and an unknown person approaching from behind. Her position, which had seemed strategically advantageous, had become a trap from which escape might prove impossible. The approaching footsteps belonged to another member of the criminal organization, arriving with additional equipment or instructions from the supervisory authority. Miss Marple pressed herself against the boulder and tried to become invisible in the shadows, hoping that the newcomer would pass without detecting her presence. But her hope was shattered when a powerful flashlight beam suddenly cut through the darkness, sweeping across the quarry area and illuminating both the digging party and Miss Marple's inadequate hiding place. A harsh voice called out in the same foreign accent she had noted earlier, "We have an observer. Bring her here." Miss Marple understood that her investigation had reached its conclusion, though not in the manner she had hoped. Her written analysis remained safely in her cottage, where it would eventually be discovered, and her observations had provided enough information to expose the criminal operation, even if she did not survive to present it personally. She had done what she could to serve justice. Now she could only hope that her sacrifice would not be in vain. Strong hands seized her arms and dragged her from behind the boulder into the area where the burial pit was being prepared. The flashlight beam revealed her captors as hard-faced men with the professional demeanor of experienced criminals, while the supervisor emerged from the shadows as a well-dressed gentleman whose cultured appearance masked a personality capable of ordering multiple murders without compunction. "Miss Jane Marple," he said, his pronunciation of her name precise despite his accent. "We have been expecting you to interfere in our affairs. Your reputation for meddling in criminal matters has preceded you to St. Mary Mead." The statement confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that her presence in the village was not coincidental. The criminals had specifically chosen St. Mary Mead as their base of operations, partly because they wanted to eliminate her, along with Mrs. Hargreaves and anyone else who might threaten their plans. Her reputation as an amateur detective had made her a target for people who could not afford to have their activities subjected to her particular brand of careful observation and logical analysis. "Where is Mrs. Hargreaves?" she asked with a calm dignity that seemed to surprise her captors. The supervisor smiled coldly. "Mrs. Hargreaves is indisposed. She learned too much about our organization and its history in this charming village. Her extensive knowledge of local affairs made her capable of recognizing connections that were better left hidden." "And the Rose Cottage connection? The previous owner who left suddenly in the early 1900s? "Gerald Morrison was my grandfather," the supervisor replied with evident satisfaction at her deductive abilities. "He established certain financial arrangements in this village many years ago that have proven durable. We have returned to collect assets that were necessarily abandoned when changing political circumstances made his continued residence inadvisable." Miss Marple began to understand the true scope of the criminal operation. The Morrison family had apparently established St. Mary Mead as a base for international criminal activities decades earlier, using the village's isolation and respectable facade to conceal illegal financial operations. Current political and economic changes had made it both possible and profitable to return and recover hidden assets. but the operation required eliminating anyone who might recognize the connections to past criminal activities. Mrs. Hargreaves, with her encyclopedic knowledge of village history and access to her late husband's legal records, had been uniquely positioned to identify the returning Morrison family and understand the significance of their presence. Her elimination had been necessary not just to protect current operations, but to prevent exposure of criminal activities that dated back generations. "The sewing circle ladies also know too much, I suppose?" Miss Marple inquired. "Unfortunately, yes. Their investigation has been remarkably thorough for amateur effort. They have identified most of the relevant connections and patterns, which makes their continued existence incompatible with our plans." The casual acknowledgement of multiple planned murders confirmed Miss Marple's worst fears about the situation. The criminals had established St. Mary Mead as their base, precisely because they intended to eliminate all witnesses to their activities, leaving behind what would appear to be a tragic series of accidents or unexplained disappearances that would never be connected to international criminal operations. But the supervisor had revealed more information than he realized in his confident explanation of their plans. Miss Marple now understood that the hidden assets they sought were probably still concealed somewhere in the village, most likely in locations that could be identified through the legal records Mrs. Hargreaves had possessed. The current operation was not just about eliminating witnesses, but about recovering valuable stolen property that had been hidden for decades. "May I see Mrs. Hargreaves before you? Complete your plans," she requested. The supervisor considered the request briefly, before nodding to one of his subordinates. "She is secure but alive. Perhaps it would be appropriate for you to bid farewell to your fellow investigator before you both contribute to our quarry restoration project." Miss Marple was escorted across the rough ground to a concealed area where Mrs. Hargreaves sat bound and gagged, but apparently unharmed. The widow's eyes brightened with both relief and despair at seeing Miss Marple, relief at discovering that someone else knew the truth about recent events, but despair at realizing that her potential rescuer had also been captured. "I'm so sorry, Constance," Miss Marple said quietly as her own bonds were secured, "but I want you to know that the truth about these people and their plans has been documented. Justice will be served, even if we don't survive to see it." Mrs. Hargreaves managed to communicate through her eyes that she understood and appreciated the attempt to help her, even though it had resulted in Miss Marple's capture. The two women settled into what might be their final hours with the dignity of people who had lived full lives and faced death with courage developed through years of service to their community. But their captors had made a crucial error in their confident assumption that the situation was entirely under their control. The supervisor's revelation about hidden assets had provided Miss Marple with information that changed her understanding of the criminal operation's timeline and objectives. If valuable property was still concealed in St. Mary Mead, the criminals would need to recover it before eliminating all witnesses, and that recovery operation might provide opportunities for escape or rescue that did not currently exist. Moreover, Miss Marple's written analysis had included specific instructions for Constable Polk about where to search for evidence and whom to arrest. Her prolonged absence from her cottage, combined with the detailed observations she had documented, would eventually alert the authorities to the true nature of recent events in St. Mary Mead. The question was whether official help would arrive in time to prevent the completion of the criminals' plans, or whether the residents of St. Mary Mead would pay the ultimate price for their proximity to secrets that had remained hidden for too many decades. As dawn began to break over the village, revealing another day of deceptive normalcy, the members of the sewing circle prepared to implement their own plan for exposing the truth about their friend's disappearance. They had no knowledge of Miss Marple's nocturnal adventure or her current captivity, but their determination to seek justice would soon bring them into direct confrontation with the same criminal forces that had already claimed 2 victims. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would determine whether justice or violence would ultimately prevail in the peaceful village of St. Mary Mead. The criminals had demonstrated their ruthless efficiency, but they had not anticipated the courage and resourcefulness of ordinary people, who refused to be intimidated by threats to their safety or their community. Mrs. Bantry woke early that morning with a sense of foreboding that she could not entirely explain. Her restless night had been filled with dreams about bloodstains and empty cottages, and she found herself repeatedly checking the locks on her doors and windows. Precautions that would have seemed absurd just days earlier, but now felt like reasonable responses to genuine danger. As she prepared her morning tea and toast, Mrs. Bantry realized that she had not seen any sign of activity from Miss Marple's cottage across the village green. The elderly lady was typically an early riser, who could be seen tending her garden or moving about her kitchen during the pre-dawn hours. But this morning, her cottage appeared dark and silent. The observation troubled Mrs. Bantry more than it might have under normal circumstances. Miss Marple's offer of assistance the previous afternoon had been both welcome and reassuring, providing the sewing circle with a sense that their amateur investigation was being guided by someone with greater experience in such matters. Her apparent absence raised concerns about whether she too had encountered the dangers that seemed to be multiplying in their formerly peaceful village. After finishing her hasty breakfast, Mrs. Bantry walked across the green to Miss Marple's cottage, intending to verify that the elderly lady was safe and to discuss the next steps in their investigation. But her knock at the front door produced no response, and peering through the windows revealed no signs of recent occupancy. The discovery of Miss Marple's detailed written analysis, prominently displayed on her sitting-room table where it could be easily seen through the front window, confirmed Mrs. Bantry's worst fears. The elderly investigator had ventured out during the night on some dangerous mission related to their case, and she had prepared this document as insurance against her possible failure to return. Mrs. Bantry hurried back to her own house and immediately telephoned Constable Polk, providing an urgent but carefully worded message about the need for immediate assistance at Miss Marple's cottage. She then contacted the other members of the sewing circle, using the pre-arranged signals they had established for emergency communication. Within an hour, the 6 women had reconvened at Mrs. Bantry's house, where they learned about Miss Marple's disappearance and the implications of her written analysis. The document confirmed many of their own theories about the connection between Mrs. Hargreaves's disappearance and the arrival of the Ashford family, but it also revealed the international scope of the criminal operation and the mortal danger facing anyone who had discovered the truth. Constable Polk arrived as they were discussing the contents of Miss Marple's analysis, and his expression grew increasingly grim as he read her observations and conclusions. The document provided enough evidence to justify immediate action against the occupants of Rose Cottage, but it also suggested that conventional police procedures might be inadequate for dealing with experienced international criminals who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder. "I'll need to contact the county authorities immediately," he decided. "This situation is far beyond what our local resources can handle. But in the meantime, I must ask all of you to remain in your homes and avoid any activities that might attract attention from these people." The request for caution was reasonable, but it came too late to protect the sewing circle members from the consequences of their investigation. The criminals had been monitoring their activities since the discovery of the bloodstain, and they had already identified each woman as a witness who needed to be eliminated before the operation could be completed. Even as Constable Polk was reading Miss Marple's analysis and preparing to contact higher authorities, The final phase of the criminal plan was being implemented. The mysterious stranger who had been observed around the village was now moving systematically from house to house, using his skills in breaking and entering to plant explosive devices that would create the appearance of a tragic series of gas, leaks and accidental fires. The plan was both simple and effective. Eliminate all witnesses to the criminal operation through apparently accidental deaths, then recover the hidden assets and depart St. Mary Mead before outside authorities could respond to the emergency. The village's isolation and limited communication facilities would delay investigation long enough for the criminals to escape with their recovered property and establish new identities in countries that did not cooperate with British law enforcement. But the plan's execution was complicated by unexpected resistance from the intended victims. Mrs. Bantry's early discovery of Miss Marple's disappearance had accelerated the timeline for official intervention, while the sewing circle's determination to seek justice for their friends had made them more alert to danger than the criminals had anticipated. Mrs. Fortescue was the first to detect signs of intrusion at her house, noting subtle disturbances in her kitchen that suggested someone had entered during her absence and tampered with her gas appliances. Her experience managing a busy household had made her sensitive to changes in familiar environments, and she immediately recognized the signs of sabotage that were intended to cause a fatal explosion. Instead of fleeing in panic, Mrs. Fortescue made careful notes of what she had observed and then quietly contacted Mrs. Bantry to report her discoveries. The two women coordinated emergency warnings to the other sewing circle members, using their knowledge of village communication networks to spread alerts more quickly than the criminals had expected. The discovery of the sabotage attempts confirmed that Miss Marple's analysis had been accurate in every detail. The criminals were indeed planning to eliminate all witnesses through methods that would appear accidental, and only the victims' careful observation and quick thinking had prevented multiple deaths. But the situation remained extremely dangerous. Mrs. Hargreaves and Miss Marple were still missing and presumably in the criminals' custody, while the remaining residents who knew the truth about recent events were being systematically targeted for elimination. Time was running short for official authorities to respond effectively, and the criminals had demonstrated both the competence and the ruthlessness that characterized professional international operations. Constable Polk, overwhelmed by the scope of the situation but determined to fulfill his duties, made the decision to confront the criminals directly rather than waiting for county authorities who might arrive too late to prevent additional murders. He understood that his limited experience with serious criminal investigations put him at a significant disadvantage, but his intimate knowledge of the village and its residents might provide advantages that outside authorities would lack. The final confrontation began when Constable Polk approached Rose Cottage in broad daylight, announcing his presence with the authority of the law and demanding that the occupants present themselves for questioning about recent criminal activities in St. Mary Mead. His bold approach was calculated to disrupt the criminals' carefully planned timeline and force them into hasty decisions that might create opportunities for the rescue of their captives. The response was immediate and violent. Instead of attempting to maintain their facade as innocent newcomers, the criminals abandoned all pretense and prepared to fight their way out of the situation through superior numbers and professional training. The peaceful village of St. Mary, Mead became the scene of the most serious criminal confrontation in its long history, with the lives of multiple residents hanging in the balance. But the criminals had underestimated both the courage of the people they had threatened and the strength of the community bonds that held St. Mary Mead together in times of crisis. The sewing circle members, rather than fleeing to safety as expected, coordinated their efforts to assist Constable Polk and to search for their missing friends. Their knowledge of local geography and their determination to see justice done proved more valuable than professional training in the desperate struggle that ensued. The battle for St. Mary Mead had begun, and its outcome would determine not only the fate of Mrs. Hargreaves and Miss Marple, but the future of the entire community that had been targeted for destruction by forces that had underestimated the power of ordinary people united in defense of their homes and their friends. The sounds of conflict echoed across the village as dawn gave way to full morning light, announcing to all residents that their peaceful world had been shattered by violence, but not necessarily destroyed. The final chapter of the mystery that had begun with a runaway spool of thread and a hidden bloodstain was being written in courage, determination, and the refusal of good people to surrender to evil without a fight. As gunfire erupted around, Rose Cottage and smoke began to rise from buildings that had been set ablaze during the struggle. The residents of St. Mary Mead faced their greatest test: whether they would allow their community to be destroyed by criminals who had sought to exploit its isolation and tranquility, or whether they would demonstrate that even the most peaceful places could generate fierce resistance when their people were threatened. The outcome of that test would determine not only the immediate fate of the village and its residents, but the legacy of courage and justice that would be remembered for generations to come. The sewing circle ladies who had begun their investigation with needles and thread would complete it with a demonstration of human strength that no criminal organization, however professional and ruthless, could ultimately defeat. The battle raged through the morning hours, with neither side able to gain decisive advantage despite the criminals' superior weapons and training. But gradually, the tide began to turn in favor of the defenders, as word of the conflict spread beyond St. Mary Mead, and county authorities arrived with reinforcements that overwhelmed the criminal organization's limited numbers. Mrs. Hargreaves and Miss Marple were rescued from their captivity at the quarry site, where they had spent long hours in fear and uncertainty, but had emerged with their lives and their determination to see justice served. The hidden assets that had brought the Morrison family back to St. Mary Mead were recovered from their decades-old concealment, providing evidence of criminal activities that dated back generations and ensuring that justice would finally be served for crimes that had gone unpunished for too long. As evening settled over the village once again, the residents of St. Mary Mead began the long process of healing from their encounter with violence and restoring the sense of security that had been shattered but not destroyed. The sewing circle would meet again, though their conversations would necessarily include memories of bloodstains and missing friends alongside their discussions of domestic concerns and village affairs. Miss Marple returned to her cottage and her knitting, but with a deeper appreciation for the courage that ordinary people could demonstrate when their communities were threatened. Mrs. Hargreaves resumed her position as the keeper of village secrets, though her knowledge now included first-hand experience of how dangerous such information could become when it fell into the wrong hands. The mystery that had begun with a simple sewing circle meeting had evolved into a testament to the power of friendship, community, and the determination of good people to protect what they held dear. The women who had discovered that first bloodstain had proven that even the most domestic and peaceful pursuits could serve as foundations for heroism when circumstances demanded courage and justice. St. Mary Mead settled back into its rhythm of quiet village life, but with new awareness of both the fragility and the strength of the bonds that held communities together. The sewing circle would continue to meet on Tuesday afternoons, but their needles and threads would always carry memories of the time when their domestic skills had served as tools for uncovering truth and defending justice against forces that had seemed overwhelming, but had ultimately been defeated by the simple refusal of ordinary people to surrender to fear. The final threads of the mystery had been woven together into a pattern that revealed both the darkest and the brightest aspects of human nature, proving once again that even in the most peaceful settings, courage and evil could clash with consequences that echoed far beyond the boundaries of any single community. The ladies of the sewing circle had learned that their quiet domestic pursuits were part of a larger tapestry of human experience that included both beauty and danger, both friendship and betrayal, but always the possibility that good could triumph, when people were willing to stand together against the forces that threatened what they held most dear.